settle in and let your breathing slow, because tonight the light is doing something it should not be able to do. You are in a quiet workshop where the air smells faintly of paint and metal, and the clocks are all holding their breath. Under a dim lamp, a tiny brush moves in patient circles, and a watch face takes on a soft green glow, the kind that feels like a friendly nightlight. You are told it is harmless, even healthy, in that old-fashioned way people used to say right before they learned better. And as the Sleepless Scientist keeps you company in the dark, you will follow that glow. From the calm routine of lip-dip paint to the slow birth of radiation safety and the very ordinary ways invisible energy still brushes past you every day. You keep your eyes on the brush as it loads up with paint, because the brush is doing the whole job. The glow is the sales pitch, but the brush is the reality. It is a small thing, almost delicate, and you are here to do delicate work. You sit at a bench that has seen too many wrists. There are watch faces laid out like tiny pale moons, each one waiting for numbers. The lamp above you is not bright. It is more like a tired spotlight. The light makes the paint look creamy, even soothing, as if it belongs on a child's toy. You touch the brush to the dial, and the paint clings in a thin line. There is a pleasure in it, the way clean marks appear where nothing was. A 1 becomes a 1, a 7 becomes a 7, and time becomes legible. It is repetitive in the way rain is repetitive, and you can almost forget you are working. And that is part of why this job existed at all. You are painting light onto objects meant for darkness. A soldier, a train conductor, a nurse on night shift, someone who cannot afford to fumble for a lamp. They want to glance down and see the hour without waking the world. Old glow paint had problems. Some of it had to drink sunlight first, like a cheap plastic sticker. It would shine for a while, then fade, embarrassed into nothing. But this paint does not need to be charged. This paint glows because it is never really still. It is always quietly doing chemistry in the dark. A steady little insistence, like a radio left on in another room. You paint it on, and it keeps performing. The people who trained you talk about it like it is a small miracle. They tell you stories you are meant to repeat later. They say radium is modern. Radium is progress. Radium is the future. They say it is in creams, in tonics, in gadgets, in advertisements with smiling faces. They say it is good for you because it is energetic, which is a very human mistake, confusing active with helpful. A house fire is energetic too, and yet the workshop does not feel like danger. It feels like routine. There is the soft scratch of chairs, the dry whisper of brushes on enamel, and the occasional cough. It smells of solvent, metal, and dust that has learned to settle everywhere. Your hands learn the movements until you do not think about them. Reach for the dial, touch the brush, lift, repeat. Time stretches thick and slow, as if you are painting minutes onto the minutes. And when the shift ends, you notice something quietly theatrical. A faint green shimmer on fingertips, on sleeves, on the edge of your apron. It looks like you have been handling a piece of moonlight. It makes you feel, for a moment, chosen. But the truth is simpler and less romantic. You are not chosen. You are just contaminated in the gentlest possible way. The glow on the dial is not the radium itself showing off. Radium is not a tiny lantern. Radium is a heavy element that cannot keep itself together forever. It falls apart, one small internal decision at a time. And once you have watched that soft green glow settle into the paint, it is natural to wonder what exactly is doing the glowing. Radiation, at its most boring, is just energy traveling away from a source. It is not a curse. It is not a cloud with intentions. It is simply something leaving something else. Sometimes radiation is a wave. That is light. That is heat. That is the warm feeling from a heater across the room. Sometimes radiation is a particle, a tiny piece of matter thrown outward. That is where things get spicier. Your body is used to gentle radiation. You live inside it. Warmth moves from skin to air. Light bounces off walls and into your eyes. Even your own cells give off tiny hints of heat, like whispered confessions. But there is a particular kind of radiation that has enough energy to change what it hits. It can knock electrons loose, like popping buttons off a shirt. That is called ionizing radiation, and the name is polite. It sounds like office work. Ionizing radiation can damage molecules in your cells. Not always, and not instantly, and not with drama. Often it is quiet, like a single typo in a book you will not read for years. Radium is a factory for ionizing radiation. It sits there and decays, meaning it transforms into other elements over time, not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. It is unstable in the way a poorly stacked shelf is unstable. Radium does not become one thing and stop. It becomes a series of things, step by step, like descending a long staircase in the dark. Each step is a new element. Each step has its own habits. Along the way, bits of energy are released. Some of that energy comes out as alpha particles. An alpha particle is like a tiny cannonball made of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. It is heavy and it does not travel far. A sheet of paper can stop it. Your outer layer of skin can stop it. And that fact is the beginning of the misunderstanding. If alpha particles cannot get through skin, people assume they are not dangerous. They forget you have an inside. They forget you have softer places. Other energy comes out as beta particles, which are fast electrons. They travel farther than alpha particles, and they are more likely to reach places they were not invited. And then there is gamma radiation, which is pure high energy light, and it is not polite at all. It goes through things, not because it is evil, but because it is indifferent. But the glowing paint, the visible green, that is not an alpha particle or a beta particle. That glow is a separate little trick. Radium is mixed with other chemicals, often a phosphor, a material that lights up when hit with radiation. The radium supplies the invisible energy, and the phosphor converts some of it into visible light. So the dial glows because it is being continuously stimulated, not by sunshine, but by decay. It is like a doorbell being pressed forever, very gently, by something you cannot see. And the workshop, with its dim lamps and careful hands, becomes a small theater for invisible physics. Each brushstroke is a delivery system, a tiny amount of radium placed precisely where someone wants light. The problem is that paint does not always stay where you put it. Powder drifts, brushes flick, sleeves drag, and your own habits, the ones that make the job easier, turn out to matter. Speaking of energy wandering where it shouldn't, the story turns uneasy when that radioactive material doesn't stay neatly on the watch face. You learn quickly that a brush does not like to be perfect. The hairs split, the tip softens, the line gets fat. Your supervisor wants numbers thin and sharp, like they were printed by a machine. So you are taught a small trick. You bring the brush to your mouth. You shape the point with your lips. You dip it back into the paint. You paint the number over and over. Lip dip paint. It is said like a rhyme, like a harmless mnemonic. It sounds almost comforting, like a recipe. And it works, because your lips are sensitive and your mouth is an excellent tool. Congratulations! You have just introduced radium into the one place your body is designed to swallow things. You do not swallow a lot at once. That would be obvious, and humans only handle obvious dangers with any enthusiasm. You swallow flecks, dust, microscopic smears, a little on the tongue, a little between teeth, a little in the back of the throat where you do not notice it. Day after day, shift after shift, you repeat the habit, and because nothing explodes, because you do not fall over, because you can still laugh at lunch, it feels safe. It feels like the kind of risk that is not a risk. Your body treats most swallowed things like trash. It moves them along. It throws them out. You are a tube with opinions, and most matter passes through. But radium is not most matter. Radium is chemically similar to calcium, and that is where the trouble starts. Your body is hungry for calcium. It uses calcium to build bones, to keep teeth hard, to make muscles contract. So when radium shows up, the body can make a mistake. It can treat radium like a familiar nutrient, like a building block. It can move it out of soft tissue and stash it in the skeleton. Imagine your bones as a living construction site. They are not dead scaffolding. They are constantly being remodeled, torn down, and rebuilt, cell by cell. There are specialized cells that chew bone away, and other cells that lay bone down. It is slow, quiet work happening beneath your ordinary life. Now imagine adding a material to that construction site that emits radiation from inside the walls. Not enough to make you glow like a cartoon, just enough to irritate the local biology over and over in the same spots. Radium that settles into bone becomes a long-term tenant. It sits close to bone marrow, where blood cells are made. It sits near delicate tissues that are busy dividing, which matters because dividing cells are easier to damage. It sits there while you go on living your life, assuming the glow is behind you. At first, there are no alarms, no warning labels, no beeping devices, no supervisor saying, softly, please stop putting the brush in your mouth. Early on, there is not even the cultural instinct to worry. Radium is fashionable. It is sold as modern. It appears in products meant to be rubbed into skin, or swallowed, or poured into bathwater. When a substance is marketed as health, it takes time for illness to be believed. And the people in the workshop, including you, are not villains. You are workers. You are doing what you are trained to do with the tools you are given for the wage you need. Your life is made of practical choices. So you keep painting. You keep shaping the brush with your lips. You keep earning your money in small, clean numbers. And because the body is so good at quietly continuing, the next part is how radium can hide in plain sight for years. Radiation injury does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive like a dramatic poison in a storybook. Sometimes it arrives like a slow administrative error, filed in the wrong cabinet, getting worse because nobody checks. The first signs can be ordinary. Fatigue that feels like bad sleep, aches that feel like getting older, a tooth that hurts, which is not exactly rare in a world without modern dentistry, a sore spot in the mouth that does not quite heal. You might blame stress. You might blame the weather. You might blame your diet, your shoes, your bad luck. Humans have an endless talent for blaming everything except the invisible thing harming them. Inside you, the radium continues to decay. Alpha particles come out, heavy and short-ranged. They dump their energy over a tiny distance, which is the key detail. Outside the body, alpha radiation is easy to block. Inside the body, that short range means the energy is concentrated right where the radium sits. It is like lighting matches inside the drywall. The fire does not spread fast, but the same spot keeps being scorched. Bone is especially vulnerable because it is active tissue. It is constantly repairing itself. Repair involves cell division. Cell division means copying DNA. And copying is when errors matter most. Radiation can damage DNA directly or indirectly by creating reactive chemicals in the cell, especially from water. Your body is mostly water, and radiation can turn that water into chemically aggressive fragments. Those fragments can then damage proteins, membranes, and genes. Your body does have repair systems. Cells are not helpless. There are enzymes that patrol like sleepy librarians looking for torn pages. They can fix a lot, but repair is not perfect. Sometimes a cell dies. Sometimes it survives with a mutation. Sometimes the tissue becomes inflamed, then scarred, then brittle. One of the cruel details is that bone pain can be delayed. Jaw problems can be delayed. By the time symptoms become obvious, the radium has been inside you for a long while, quietly paying rent. You might begin with dental trouble. A tooth loosens, gums become tender, infections become more frequent. A sore might open and not close. The jawbone is a common place for trouble because teeth and jaw are busy, vascular, and prone to minor injuries. Every bite is stress. Every tiny cut in the mouth is a doorway for bacteria. Healing requires good blood supply and healthy bone. If bone tissue is compromised, healing becomes sluggish. Infection can take advantage. Necrosis can occur, meaning tissue death, which is a clinical word for something deeply unpleasant. And because this is happening in an era with less effective antibiotics and less refined medical imaging, doctors are often guessing. They see symptoms that could be many things. They may diagnose anemia, or rheumatism, or dental disease, or bad hygiene. Employers may also guess, but in a different direction. They may call it unrelated. They may call it coincidence. They may call it anything that does not require changing the factory. The real horror is not a sudden collapse. It is the long stretch of normal days that do not feel normal anymore. You still wake up. You still work. You still smile when you have to. But you are always tired in a way rest does not fix. Your bones ache in a way warmth does not soothe. You feel as if your body has become slightly less yours, as if it is slowly misplacing itself. And in the background, the paint still glows. Your coworkers still shape brushes with their lips. The workshop still smells like metal and solvent. Everything looks the same, which is how a slow disaster prefers to operate. There is also the strange social effect of invisible harm. If you cannot see the danger, you start doubting yourself. You start wondering if you are exaggerating, if you are being difficult, if you are just weak. That doubt buys the hazard more time. But patterns do not care about doubt. If enough people suffer in similar ways, the similarity starts to harden into a shape. And once a shape appears, science has something to grab. But once enough people get sick in similar ways, patterns start to form. And patterns are where science wakes up. At first, the pattern is just gossip with a pulse. One worker gets sick, then another. Then someone mentions a jaw problem, and somebody else goes quiet because they have one too. In those days, the word radiation is not a household comfort. It is still new enough to be magical and scary enough to be distant. People know about X-rays, perhaps. They might have heard stories of burns from early imaging machines, but the idea that paint could be the problem feels almost ridiculous. So, how do you prove it? How do you take something invisible and make it undeniable? You do it the boring way. You compare groups, you keep records, you write down names, dates, jobs, symptoms. You do not rely on a single dramatic case. If you were an investigator, you would walk into the world with a notebook instead of a sword. You would talk to workers. You would look for who handled radium and who did not. You would ask how long they worked, what tasks they did, whether they used their mouths on the brushes. And because this is early occupational health science, you would be building methods as you go. You would be inventing the modern idea that workplace exposures can be measured and managed. Some evidence is painfully simple. Workers who did not handle radium do not show the same cluster of illnesses. Workers who did, especially those who pointed brushes with their lips, show more trouble. But the world is messy. People move between jobs. People have other health issues. People smoke. People drink. People get infections. So the case is built gradually, like stacking stones into a wall. There are also physical measurements, which is where the story gets eerie in a quiet way. Radium emits radiation, and radiation can be detected. Even with early instruments, you can sometimes measure faint radioactivity on clothing, on hair, on skin, and, in some cases, in breath. Because part of radium's decay chain involves radon gas, a radioactive gas that can leave the body. If radium is in bone, radon can be produced and then exhaled. That means a person can, in a measurable way, breathe out a signature of what is inside them. It is not dramatic. There is no green smoke. There is just air, and then a detector quietly clicking, a small sound that says, yes, something is happening. The idea that your breath could be radioactive is the kind of fact that makes a room go silent. Not because it is supernatural, because it is so mundane. You are not a monster. You are not a reactor. You are a person, sitting in a chair, exhaling like anyone else. And yet, the instrument notices. There were also studies involving bones after death. measuring radioactivity in skeletal tissue. It is a grim kind of proof, the kind that arrives late, but it is hard to argue with. The evidence did not arrive as one perfect courtroom moment. It arrived as a pile of small truths that would not go away. Each medical case, each measurement, each pattern in the records, another sheet of paper on the stack, and when the stack gets tall enough, denial becomes effortful. You have to work at ignoring it. You have to spend money and time building explanations that do not fit as well, which of course people will do, especially when money is involved. And once the truth refuses to leave the room, the next question is what anyone does with it, especially when money is involved. So you watch what happens when a truth becomes expensive. You can feel the room change first, before any policy does. The workshop is the same size, the same smell of solvent and metal. But the conversations tighten like someone pulled a string. You are still painting numbers that glow in the dark. But now, there is a second glow in the story. Attention. Attention from doctors, reporters, lawyers, and accountants. Because when people get sick, the question is not only what happened, the question becomes, who has to pay for what happened? And that question has a way of making adults behave like children. The company line at first is as smooth as enamel paint. They suggest the workers are simply, they imply there were infections, bad teeth, bad habits, bad luck. It is a strategy as old as smoke in a crowded room. If you cannot deny the cough, you blame the lungs. And you, the worker, are in a strange position. You are not asking to be famous. You are asking for your own pain to be taken seriously. You are also living in a time where a workplace is not expected to be safe. It is expected to be productive. A factory is a machine, and workers are parts you replace. So when you say, quietly, I think the paint did this, you are not only accusing a substance, you are accusing a whole social habit of looking away. There is also the simple difficulty of time. Radiation sickness from internal radium is slow. It arrives on a schedule that does not match payroll. A cut finger heals in days, so you can connect cause and effect. A bone weakening over years is harder to pin down. Human brains love immediate consequences and hate delayed invoices. That delay becomes a legal fog. You worked here for years, yes, but can you prove this illness is from here? Can you prove it is not from something else? Can you prove it well enough to satisfy people trained to doubt? Meanwhile, you still have a body to live in. If your jaw hurts, it hurts, whether or not a court agrees. If your bones fracture easily, they do not wait for paperwork. So, the sick workers begin to push in the only ways available. They talk to doctors who will listen. They find journalists who can write what the company will not say. And they find lawyers, which is when the story becomes very modern. Because science can show what is happening, but law decides what it means. Some cases become famous, not because fame is pleasant, but because public attention is one of the few tools that works. There is a particular cruelty in needing to be visibly damaged to be believed. Invisible harm is always treated like a rumor. And radium, for a long time, is the perfect invisible harm. The workers who are ill are often exhausted. They may be in pain, anemic, underweight, struggling to eat. And now they are asked to perform their suffering on demand, to file claims, to sit for interviews, to give statements, to be examined by doctors hired by people who prefer a different conclusion. Congratulations, you are now a medical exhibit in your own life. In courtrooms, the language shifts. Words like dose and exposure get translated into liability and negligence. One side says correlation, the other side says coincidence. And the most maddening part is that the science is not mysterious. Radium is radioactive, and internal exposure is dangerous. But admitting that out loud has consequences that echo beyond one factory. If a company admits responsibility, it sets a precedent. It means other workers in other places can ask similar questions. It means new rules, new costs, new delays, new inspections. It means profit has to share the room with precaution. And profit does not like roommates. So denial stretches on. Sometimes, with a straight face, there are arguments that the radium is too weak to matter. There are arguments that the workers are lying, or hysterical, or immoral. The arguments change shape, but the goal stays the same. Keep the glow on the dial and keep the blame off the ledger. While this happens, you can imagine the workshop still operating. Fresh batches of paint, new hires, careful hands, the same rhyme, lip, dip, paint, repeated like a prayer. And that is the part that turns the stomach most gently. The harm is not only in what happened, but in what continues. A slow disaster prefers continuity. Eventually, pressure builds from the outside. Newspaper stories make the glow look less like magic. Public sympathy shifts because it is hard to admire a novelty when it is chewing through someone's jaw. The cases, taken together, become difficult to ignore, not because corporations grow a conscience overnight, but because the cost of denial begins to rise. There is also the quiet work of physicians and researchers, the ones who keep writing things down and comparing notes, the ones who treat the workplace like an experiment that forgot consent. They learn to ask better questions. They learn that exposure is not only about being near radium, it is about touching it, inhaling it, swallowing it. They learn that habits matter, and tiny repeated doses add up. A single brush point is nothing until it is every day. A single fleck is nothing until it is thousands. And so, slowly, the legal battle becomes a scientific lesson. The courtroom becomes a classroom with worse lighting. The verdicts, settlements, and headlines become warnings. Not clean warnings, not perfect warnings, but enough to change how the world talks about radiation. Enough to create a new kind of fear and a new kind of respect. Because radium is not the last invisible hazard humans will monetize. It is simply one of the first to be measured in bone. Out of the lawsuits and the public attention comes something oddly practical. Not justice, exactly, because justice is a hungry word, but procedures, rules, limits, and habits that reduce harm. Safety is rarely born from kindness. It is usually born from embarrassment and paperwork, so you begin to see changes that look small but matter. A supervisor stops encouraging the mouth trick. A poster appears reminding workers not to put brushes near lips. The paint is handled differently. Workspaces are cleaned more carefully. Dust control becomes an idea, then a routine. Ventilation improves because dust and fumes have a way of carrying trouble. Windows are opened, fans are installed, air is moved on purpose. It is not glamorous, but it is life-saving. You begin to see designated areas for radioactive materials, containers with lids, labels that do not pretend anymore. A new tone enters the room, less cheerful, more precise. And precision is what safety really is. Not bravery, not good intentions. Precision and the willingness to assume humans will make mistakes. Because you will make mistakes, not because you are careless, but because you are human. You get tired, you get distracted, you want to go home. The safer system is the one that expects that. The safer system does not rely on perfect behavior. It relies on barriers, habits, and measurement. Measurement becomes the new obsession. Once people admit radiation can harm, the next question is how much? How much is too much? How much is tolerable? How much is normal? That is where the idea of dose becomes a daily tool. Dose is not just whether radiation exists. Dose is how much energy reaches tissue and for how long. It is the difference between standing near a campfire briefly and living inside the firewood. Dose is also why radium is such a teacher. External exposure might be low enough to seem harmless. Internal exposure is a different universe. So workplaces begin to separate the material from mouths and lungs. No more brush pointing with lips, at least in places that learned. Brushes are shaped with tools, or with water, not saliva. Workers may be given protective clothing, aprons that stay at work. Hand washing becomes more than a polite suggestion. Eating at the bench becomes a bad idea instead of a normal one. There is also the slow birth of monitoring devices. Early radiation detection can be crude, but it is something. Geiger counters, film badges, other dosimeters. A film badge is almost charmingly simple. You wear a small packet of photographic film. Radiation fogs it, the way light would. Later, someone develops the film and sees how dark it got. Your exposure becomes a shadow on a strip of plastic. It is a quiet way to make the invisible leave a mark. Time limits become part of safety culture too, not because radiation is always present, but because it accumulates. If you must work near sources, you rotate people. Distance becomes a tool. Radiation often weakens quickly as you move away. So you use toms, you use shielding, you step back. Shielding is another unglamorous hero. Lead, concrete steel, anything dense enough to slow energy down. A wall that does not care about your schedule. Containment becomes a concept, then a design principle. Keep the material sealed. Keep dust from becoming airborne. Keep the hazard where it can be managed. And you can feel how different this is from the early days. Early radium work treated the substance like glitter. Now, it is treated like a stubborn animal that needs a cage. The language changes too. Instead of miracle and vitality, you hear contamination and exposure. Instead of glowing beauty, you hear decay chain and half-life. Half-life is one of those calm, cold phrases. It means the time it takes for half the atoms to decay. Not half the material to vanish, just half to change identity. For radium, that time is long enough to outlast a career, which means the material keeps producing radiation steadily. It does not get tired. It does not forget. So the rules are built to match that patience. because radioactivity is patient, and you are not. As safety develops, people start to formalize limits. How much exposure per year is acceptable for workers? How to track cumulative dose over a lifetime? These limits shift over time as science improves. Early limits can be too high based on incomplete knowledge. Later limits tighten because caution grows with evidence. And along the way, a strange cultural transformation happens. Radiation becomes both feared and normalized. It becomes a hazard you can measure, which makes it less mythical. Because the most frightening thing about radiation is the invisibility. Once you can hear clicks, see fogged film, read numbers, the fear becomes less supernatural and more logistical. Logistical fear is still fear, but it is manageable. It becomes part of engineering and planning. It becomes something you can build around. This is the quiet birth of radiation safety as a discipline. Health physics, occupational standards, regulatory agencies, a whole world of people whose job is to worry calmly. And there is something almost tender about that. Not because the story is kind, but because learning is possible. The universe does not care if you learn, but you can anyway. The dial painters and the researchers who documented their harm become part of the foundation for that learning, a foundation that is, unfortunately, made of real bones. Once you start thinking this way, you begin to notice something else. Radiation is not only in factories and laboratories. It is not only in painted dials and medical machines. It is, in small ways, woven into ordinary life. The earth beneath your home contains uranium and thorium in trace amounts. Old rocks carry their own slow decay, their own faint emissions. The ground is not dead. It is just extremely patient. When you walk across soil, you are walking over mild radioactivity. Not enough to matter much, but enough to be real. The planet hums quietly in ionizing whispers. Some places have more than others. Granite can have higher natural radioactivity than softer stone. Certain regions have soils that release more radon gas. Radon is part of the same family story as radium, a noble gas, invisible, odorless, and politely indifferent. It seeps out of ground and can collect in basements. It is one of those hazards that sounds dramatic in concept, but is handled with boring tools like ventilation and testing kits. Again, safety is mostly air movement and paperwork. You also live beneath a sky that is not entirely friendly. Cosmic rays drift down from space, high-energy particles. They collide with the atmosphere and make showers of secondary particles. Most of it is blocked by air and magnetic fields. But some reaches you, especially at high altitudes. The higher you go, the less atmosphere you have above you. So a person on a mountain gets a little more cosmic radiation. A pilot gets more than that by spending hours above much of the air. It is not a crisis, but it is a measurable difference. This is the calming and unsettling truth together. Radiation is normal in small doses. Life evolved on a mildly radioactive planet. Your cells have always dealt with background damage, not only from radiation, but from chemical reactions inside the body. Metabolism itself produces reactive byproducts. In a sense, you are always under gentle attack by your own chemistry, and you survive by constantly repairing. Life is a repair process with delusions of stability. Even your food contains naturally occurring radioactive material. Bananas, for example, contain potassium, and a tiny fraction is radioactive. That does not make bananas dangerous. It makes them honest. You are made of elements, and elements have histories. Some of those histories include unstable isotopes. Isotope is just an atom with a different number of neutrons. Some isotopes are stable, some are not. The unstable ones decay, releasing energy. And that energy is what we call radiation. So when people say radiation is everywhere, it is not poetry. It is literally in the dirt, the air, the food, the stone. It is also in you, faintly, because you are not separate from Earth. The fear comes when dose rises or when exposure becomes internal. The dial painter story is a lesson in both. Small amounts, repeated, swallowed, stored. But ordinary background radiation is usually low. Low enough that your repair systems handle it. Low enough that it becomes part of the noise of living. The trick is not to treat all radiation as the same monster. It is to treat it like fire. A candle is useful. A house fire is a disaster. Context and amount are everything. Distance, time, shielding, and route of exposure. Those boring words are what separate medicine from tragedy. And speaking of medicine, there is another twist in this story. The same phenomenon that harmed those workers, when unmeasured, became a tool once humans learned to be careful, because radiation is not only a hazard, it is also information, and in the right hands, a kind of flashlight. You can imagine yourself in a hospital room now, years later. Not a factory, but still a place of bright paint and quiet fear. You smell disinfectant, plastic, and warmed linen. A technician positions a machine, calm and efficient. They do not speak in miracles. They speak in protocols. They wear badges that track dose, like tiny, silent accountants. In diagnostic imaging, radiation can pass through the body, and different tissues absorb it differently. Bone blocks more, soft tissue blocks less. An X-ray image is basically a shadow picture, not of light, but of tissue density, a way to see fractures, infections, tumors, foreign objects. It is not magic, even if it feels like it at 3 in the morning. It is physics applied with caution, a controlled exposure for a purpose. And then there is nuclear medicine, which is even closer to the dial story. Sometimes doctors give a patient a small amount of radioactive tracer. A tracer is a labeled molecule that goes where a molecule normally goes. It might be attached to glucose, so it collects in tissues using glucose. It might target the thyroid because the thyroid absorbs iodine. It might follow blood flow through the heart. The tracer emits radiation that detectors can pick up. So instead of seeing anatomy like an X-ray, you see function, where things go, how fast, where they concentrate. It is like putting a faintly glowing dye into a river at night and watching where the currents carry it. Except the river is your bloodstream. These tracers are chosen to have short half-lives. They decay quickly, so they do not linger long. They are designed to do their job, then fade. It is a kind of domesticated radioactivity, a dangerous force taught to behave through engineering and planning, not made harmless, but made useful. Radiation is also used in treatment, especially for cancer. This is where the story becomes blunt. Radiation damages cells, and cancer cells divide rapidly. Dividing cells are more vulnerable to damage. So if you aim radiation carefully, you can harm the tumor more. You are still harming normal tissue, but you try to minimize it. Modern radiotherapy is an art of geometry and patience. Multiple beams from different angles, shaped to match the tumor. Doses fractionated, meaning spread out over time. Fractionation gives normal tissue time to repair between sessions. Cancer cells often repair less effectively, so you exploit the difference gently with repeated controlled injury. It is unsettling. If you think about it too directly, you treat disease by causing damage on purpose. Congratulations, you have weaponized physics against biology. But that is much of medicine. A balance of harm and benefit managed with measurement. The same theme again, just with cleaner floors. In research, radioactive tracers are used like tiny spies. They help scientists track molecules in metabolic pathways. They show where nutrients go, how drugs distribute. In ecology, tracers can track water movement, sediment flow. In industry, radiation can inspect welds, measure thickness. It can sterilize medical equipment, kill microbes reliably. All of this depends on rules that were not obvious at first. Rules that grew from stories like the dial painters. Rules that assume the invisible will hurt you if you let it. Respect is the right word, though it sounds sentimental. You respect radiation the way you respect a blade, not by worshiping it and not by pretending it is a toy. You build tools and habits and limits. You measure dose, you control exposure routes. You keep it out of mouths, lungs, and unshielded curiosity, and that brings you back in a slow mental loop to the workshop. The dim lamp, the small brush, the green glow that feels friendly, a light that was never free, just unbilled. You can picture the benches, the rows of watch faces, the workers leaning forward, shoulders tense from fine detail, the gentle ticking of timepieces waiting to be assembled. You can also picture the later version of the same room. The signs, the gloves, the covered containers, the quiet insistence on not using your mouth as a tool. The glow is still there, but the innocence is gone. Innocence is always expensive in hindsight. It is the cost of not knowing, paid by someone who had no choice. And yet, the lesson is not only tragedy. The lesson is that invisible things can be tamed by attention, not fully controlled, not made kind, but managed. There are so many invisible things in your life already. Air pressure pressing on you like a steady hand, bacteria in your mouth negotiating for sugar, gravity insisting you stay in bed, which for once is convenient, electromagnetic waves filling your room, carrying signals and static. You survive among these forces by not thinking about them. Until you have to. Radiation is one of the few invisibles that humans learn to quantify early. Clicks in a detector, fog on film, counts in a chart. A hazard that forced measurement to become culture, because culture is what keeps you safe when memory fades. A rule written down outlives the person who learned it the hard way. A habit taught to new workers can prevent an old mistake. And the old mistake in this case was simple. Do not eat your tools. Do not swallow your job. But there is a deeper mistake too, one that repeats across centuries, assuming that because harm is subtle, it is not real. Assuming that because profit is immediate, it is more true. Science, at its best, is the slow refusal to accept convenient stories. It is the patient stacking of evidence until denial gets tired. And denial does get tired eventually, not because it becomes ashamed, but because it becomes outnumbered by data, by cases, by instruments that keep clicking, by workers who keep speaking even when it costs them. And with that in mind, you can stay with the image of the glow a little longer, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder of what energy does. Energy moves, it transfers, it changes things. Sometimes it changes phosphor into soft green light. Sometimes it changes bone into something fragile and inflamed. Sometimes it changes a workplace into a new kind of regulated space. And all of that depends on the same quiet process. Atoms rearranging themselves, one decay at a time. A staircase of transformations creaking downward through time. Speaking of staircases, there is another slow descent hidden in this story. Not of elements, but of the human body's own systems and how they try to cope when damage arrives too steadily to ignore. Because even when you stop the exposure, the body still has to respond. It has to repair, compensate, scar, and adapt. Sometimes that response is noble in a boring way. Inflammation, cleanup, fresh cells trying again. And sometimes the response is just a compromise, a scar, where flexibility used to live. You feel it first as small inconveniences that refuse to stay small. A bruise that lingers, a sore gum line that keeps reopening like a badly patched seam, a deep ache that is not in the skin but underneath, where you cannot rub it away. Inside your bones, there is a routine you never asked for. Old bone is constantly being dissolved by cells called osteoclasts. New bone is constantly being rebuilt by cells called osteoblasts. It is maintenance, the kind that keeps you upright without applause. Now add radium, tucked into that mineral lattice like counterfeit calcium. Every time the bone remodels, it stirs the contamination. Every microscopic demolition and rebuild shifts atoms around, and the radiation keeps landing in the same neighborhood. Your body responds to injury with signaling molecules, chemical memos that say, "Fix this." Blood flow increases, immune cells arrive, repair proteins assemble like scaffolding. But radiation is not a one-time injury. It is a steady drizzle of damage from inside the structure. The repair crew shows up, and the ceiling keeps collapsing. Congratulations! You have a problem that behaves like a bad subscription. You cannot cancel it by simply leaving the workshop. Even if you never paint another dial, the radium you swallowed can stay. The half-life is long, which means the decay is slow. Slow decay sounds gentle until you remember it means persistent. You might stop exposure, but you do not stop physics. The atoms do not care about your resignation letter, and because the mouth was the entry point, the mouth often becomes the battleground. The jawbone has teeth anchored into it, like posts in living stone. That area is constantly stressed, constantly exposed to bacteria, constantly repairing minor damage. In healthy bone, that repair is quiet and effective. In compromised bone, the repair becomes hesitant. Blood supply can be disrupted. The immune response can become weaker right where it is needed. So you can end up with osteonecrosis, meaning bone death. That word is clinical, but what it translates to is simple. Living tissue becomes non-living tissue, and the body struggles to remove it. Dead bone does not have circulation. No blood means few immune cells. Few immune cells means bacteria get comfortable. In the early 20th century, dentistry is not what you want it to be. Tooth extractions are common, and they are not gentle. If your jawbone is already struggling, an extraction can become a wound that never truly closes. The infection can spread along the bone. Pain becomes a constant roommate. Breath can take on a smell that is not about hygiene, but about tissue breaking down. And all of this can happen while you still look mostly normal at a glance. You can still walk, you can still show up, you can still be told you are fine if the person speaking prefers that outcome. Meanwhile, there is another invisible system taking hits: your blood production. Bone marrow lives inside many bones, soft and busy. It produces red blood cells that carry oxygen, white blood cells that fight infection, and platelets that help you clot. Radiation near marrow can damage the stem cells that keep this factory running. Over time, you might develop anemia, which is a shortage of healthy red cells. You feel weak, short of breath, cold in a way blankets cannot fix. Low white blood cells can mean infections become frequent. Small cuts get angry. Mouth sores become more common. Illness that used to be a weekend inconvenience becomes something that drags on. And because biology likes to pile problems together, bone weakness can join in. Radiation can disrupt the cells that maintain bone structure. Bones can become brittle, fractures easier, healing slower. It is a slow collapse of reliability. The body does not fail dramatically. It becomes less cooperative, piece by piece. A machine that still runs, but louder, rougher, and with more smoke. This is what makes the dial painter story so haunting in retrospect. The glow was constant, but the harm was delayed. Humans are not built to fear delayed harm. We are built to fear teeth and thunder. So the early years are full of misinterpretation. A doctor might see jaw infection and think of poor dental care. A doctor might see fatigue and blame diet, stress, or the vague category called nerves. And employers, well, employers have their own immune system. It is made of lawyers, public relations statements, and selective curiosity. When you are living through it, you do not get a neat label at first. You just get a series of appointments, opinions, and bills. You get the sensation of being slowly unrecognized by your own body. It is also possible, in some cases, to develop cancers years later. Radiation damage can lead to mutations that let cells grow without restraint. Bone cancers and head and neck cancers were among the risks observed. Cancer is not a guaranteed outcome, and it is not a moral punishment. It is a statistics game played with cells, and the house always wins eventually. What the workers experienced was not one single disease with one clean signature. It was a spectrum of damage, bone injury, marrow injury, infections, tumors, a cluster of outcomes tied together by one shared habit and one shared element. And here is the part that gets painfully practical. Once investigators recognized the mechanism, they could predict who was most at risk. If you were taught lip, dip, paint, your risk was higher. If you were in a room with poor ventilation and lots of dust, higher. If you handled the powder directly, cleaned the benches, shook out aprons, higher. Route mattered. Swallowed radium was dangerous because it became internal. Inhaled radium dust was dangerous for similar reasons. Lungs are soft, vascular, and unforgiving. External exposure could still matter, but it was the internal contamination that made this story so cruel. Because internal contamination turns your own skeleton into the source. And that is why the early safety changes focused on behavior first. Not because behavior is the best defense, but because it was the easiest to change on paper. No more brush tipping with lips. No food at the bench. Wash hands before breaks. Keep work clothes at work. It sounds obvious now, like a list you would tape to a refrigerator. But obviousness is a luxury that arrives after injuries. In those early reforms, you also start to see the birth of a new kind of worker supervision. Not just timing your output, but measuring your environment. Air sampling becomes a thing people do. Air sampling is as unromantic as it sounds. You pull air through a filter, then test what was caught. Dust becomes data. Surface wipes become data too. A cloth swiped over a bench can be checked for radioactive residue. The glow is replaced by numbers, which is less pretty and more useful. And then there is the strange practice of bioassay. That is a fancy word for checking the body's outputs. Urine, for example, for radioactive substances. If the body is excreting it, in some cases, breath measurements were used because of radon. Radium decays, eventually producing radon gas. Radon can leave the bones, enter the bloodstream, and be exhaled. So you, a person trying to live quietly, can be asked to breathe into a device. And the device listens not to your lungs, but to your atoms. It is intimate in the worst way. Not a confession of thoughts, a confession of contamination. This kind of monitoring slowly becomes part of occupational health. If you can measure exposure, you can set limits. If you can set limits, you can enforce them, at least sometimes. And once enforcement exists, a new concept becomes normal. The idea that a workplace owes you not just a wage, but a boundary on how much harm you absorb. That is not a sentimental change. It is bureaucratic. It is forms and inspectors and committees. But bureaucracy is sometimes the only language industry understands. The universe is indifferent, and so is a factory ledger, unless you make it care. Standards begin to emerge, guided by early radiation scientists and medical researchers. In the earliest days of radiation work, some scientists used themselves as test subjects. They handled sources with bare hands because curiosity is a powerful solvent. Some paid for that with burns, cancers, amputations. Their injuries became warnings too. Not as famous as the dial painters, but part of the same lesson. A new profession forms around this caution. Health physics, the practice of measuring radiation and controlling exposure. It is a job for people who like instruments, rules, and quietly preventing disasters. They focus on the three classic tools: time, spend less of it near the source; distance, keep away when you can; shielding, put dense material between you and the radiation. Then you add the newer tool that the dial painters made painfully necessary: containment. Do not let radioactive material enter bodies in the first place. Containment means closed containers. It means glove boxes and fume hoods. It means cleaning methods that do not kick dust back into the air. It means changing the process so that a worker's mouth is never part of the equipment. You can feel how modern this thinking is. It does not assume perfect people. It assumes tired people, distracted people, people who sneeze and scratch their faces. It is safety designed around human reality, not human ideals. And as these practices spread, radium itself begins to lose its cultural glow. The early radium craze fades as more harm is documented. The world gets less enchanted and more cautious. Radium is still used for a time, but in more controlled ways. Eventually, safer materials replace it in many products. Tritium, for example, becomes common in self-luminous devices. Tritium is radioactive too, but it behaves differently. It emits low-energy beta radiation, easier to contain and shield. When sealed properly, it is less hazardous than radium paint was. The point is not that tritium is a cuddle toy. The point is that humans learned slowly to choose hazards with fewer teeth. Because once a society learns to measure an invisible risk, it begins seeing other invisible risks too. Lead, asbestos, industrial solvents, airborne particulates, a whole invisible zoo. The radium dial painters are one of the reasons those later fights had a template. Record keeping, exposure measurement, comparison groups, cumulative dose. And here, in the background, the scientific idea of dose becomes more refined. Not just how much radiation exists, but how it interacts with tissue. Different types of radiation deposit energy differently. Alpha particles are heavy and deposit energy densely over short distances. Beta particles are lighter with longer range and different interactions. Gamma rays pass through, scattering energy along the way. So scientists develop weighting factors, ways to compare biological impact. They create units: Gray for absorbed dose, sievert for effective dose. Those words do not matter for bedtime, but the concept does. Not all radiation hurts the same way, even at the same energy. Internal alpha emitters can be especially damaging because of dense energy deposition. That is why radium, when swallowed, was so devastating. It placed an alpha source right next to living tissue for years. Once that is understood, safety guidelines become more sophisticated. Limits for external exposure and separate limits for internal contamination. Rules about ingestion and inhalation, not just proximity. And in the workplace, you begin to see simple rituals that are quietly life-saving. Washing hands, changing clothes, using disposable covers, monitoring work areas for contamination. There is something almost monastic about it, not in the spiritual sense, in the repetitive sense. Small acts performed consistently to keep invisible harm from becoming personal. Because the universe is efficient. If you give it a path into your body, it will take it, not because it hates you, because it has no opinion. Now, to keep the story honest, you also have to hold a second truth. Not every dial painter got sick. Not every exposure led to catastrophe. Dose mattered, and behavior mattered, and luck mattered. Biology varies between individuals, and so does exposure intensity. Some workers did not use the mouth-pointing method as often. Some worked fewer years. Some were in better ventilated rooms. Some simply had less internal uptake for reasons that are still not fully predictable. This variability is another reason it took time to prove. A hazard that kills everyone quickly is obvious. A hazard that injures some people slowly is the perfect shape for denial. But eventually, the statistical pattern became too consistent to ignore, and once ignored truths become expensive, systems change. Now, let the story drift outward from the factory again, because the safety ideas born here did not stay in watchmaking. They moved into medicine, research, energy, and everyday regulation. In hospitals, X-ray use became more controlled. Lead aprons, shielding walls, calibrated doses, careful positioning, time, distance, shielding, repeated in a cleaner room. Technicians learned to step behind barriers before exposures. Patients were given only the needed images, not extra out of curiosity. Equipment improved, so images required less radiation. In nuclear medicine, tracers were chosen with short half-lives. The goal was always the same: enough signal to get information, then let it fade. Do the job, then decay into irrelevance. And outside medicine, radiation safety became part of larger infrastructure. In industrial radiography, workers used sealed sources with strict controls. In research labs, radioactive isotopes were tracked like money. Inventories were maintained. Waste was labeled. Contamination surveys were routine. You do not just toss radioactivity into a trash can and hope. Well, you do not if you want to keep your job. Radiation work also pushed improvements in instrument design. Geiger counters became more reliable and portable. Scintillation detectors were used for better sensitivity, converting radiation into light pulses. There is an odd symmetry there. The dial paint used phosphors to turn radiation into visible glow. Detectors use similar principles, turning invisible events into something measurable. The difference is intention. One was a product novelty, the other is a warning system. One sells romance, the other sells prevention. And now you arrive at a calmer, modern truth. Because radiation is everywhere in small amounts, the question becomes practical. What counts as acceptable risk? You live in a world where background radiation is normal. Cosmic rays, soil radioactivity, radon in some regions. Even your own body with potassium and carbon isotopes. So safety is not about eliminating radiation. It is about keeping exposures low and justified. In radiation protection, there is a principle often summarized as low as reasonably achievable. Not zero, because zero is fantasy. Reasonably achievable, because the real world has costs and trade-offs. This principle is a mature form of the dial painter lesson. Do not pretend the hazard is imaginary. Do not pretend you can erase it completely either. Measure, reduce, contain, and respect. Respect, again, is the right word. Not worship, not panic. A sober relationship with an indifferent phenomenon. Now, because this is a bedtime story for the existentially curious, you are allowed to sit with a quieter question. Why did people believe radium was healthy in the first place? It is tempting to call them foolish. That is what people always do to the past, to make the present feel smarter. But early radium hype grew from a real discovery. Radioactivity was astonishing and new and poorly understood. Anything that produced energy without fire felt like a miracle. It also arrived in an era that loved tonics and cure-alls. People sold products with confident labels and thin evidence. Regulation was weaker, and marketing was loud. Radium fit perfectly into that culture. It glowed. It sounded scientific, and it was associated with famous researchers like Marie Curie. Fame has a way of rubbing off onto objects that do not deserve it. Also, there was a confusing truth underneath the hype. Radiation can kill cells, and that sometimes can be useful. It can reduce certain growths, and later it could treat cancers. So the line between harm and benefit was not obvious yet. The same force can heal in one context and maim in another. That complexity is where human storytelling tends to fail. Humans prefer simple labels, good or bad, miracle or curse. But nature is not a moral system. Nature is a toolbox full of blades. Radium, used carefully, could be a tool. Radium, swallowed daily, became a slow internal weapon. And because you are you, lying safely in bed while all of this happened to other bodies in other decades, you can let your mind rest on another calm fact. The scientific method, at its best, is built for exactly this kind of confusion. It does not rely on vibes. It relies on comparison, measurement, and repeating observations. It is designed to outlast marketing, but it is also slow. Pain teaches faster than data sometimes. That is why safety rules often have a human price tag. In the dial painter era, one of the turning points was the willingness to do careful epidemiology. That means studying patterns of disease in populations, linking outcomes to exposures. Again, a boring word for a sharp tool. Investigators compared illness rates between exposed and unexposed workers. They documented timelines, job tasks, and symptom progression. They built cases that could survive skeptical questioning, and they also dealt with a fundamental challenge. Radiation damage can look like other diseases. Jaw necrosis can mimic infection from many causes. So proof required multiple lines of evidence: clinical symptoms, physical measurements, and chemical logic. Radium behaves like calcium, and bone receives the dose. This multi-pronged approach is how modern occupational health works. Not one dramatic test, but converging clues. Over time, that approach expanded beyond radium. Lead exposure, for example, became recognized through patterns of anemia and neurological symptoms. Asbestos exposure became linked to lung disease through long-term studies. Each hazard had its own timeline, its own denial, its own bureaucracy. But the template became familiar. And yes, that is a slightly bleak thought, because it implies that learning often happens only after harm. Still, there is a gentler angle. Once the learning happens, it tends to spread. The dial painter tragedy helped protect later workers who never heard their names. It is a quiet kind of immortality, not the glamorous kind, the administrative kind. Now, let your imagination drift back into the workshop, but in a later year. You are still you, still seated at the bench, but the room has changed. The containers are closed. The powders are handled under ventilation. The air smells less dusty, more filtered. There is a sink nearby, and people actually use it. There are separate coats kept in lockers, never taken home. Because that was another early mistake: contamination traveling into houses. When you take radioactive dust home on clothing, it spreads to furniture, bed sheets, children. The hazard becomes domestic, woven into the soft parts of life. Safety culture had to learn to stop hazards at the door. So now, there are laundry protocols. There are disposal bins. There are rules about personal items in work areas. The glow is less romantic now. It is treated like a chemical process with a risk profile, and that is progress. even if it feels colder. You might also see monitoring at the end of a shift. A worker holds hands near a detector. Shoes are checked. Work surfaces are scanned. The detector clicks when it finds contamination, not because it is angry, because it is honest. If contamination is found, there are procedures. Cleaning with damp cloths, not dry sweeping that launches dust. Removing contaminated clothing. Documenting incidents so patterns are caught early. Documentation is another unglamorous hero. If you do not write it down, it did not happen, at least not in the eyes of management. So, modern safety systems love paperwork. Forms, logs, audits, training records. It is tedious, but it builds institutional memory. And because institutions forget faster than individuals die, memory matters. Now, before the story moves on, there is one more technical detail worth holding gently. Radium does not just emit one type of radiation and stop. It decays through a chain, producing other radioactive daughters. Each daughter has its own half-life and emissions. That means radium contamination can be complicated. The hazard is not just radium, but the family it turns into. This is why internal radium exposure could produce radon gas, and why breath could be measured. It is also why bone measurements after death could show not only radium, but its decay products. In simple terms, swallowing radium is like planting a seed. It does not grow into a plant, it grows into a lineage of radioactive events. A slow family tree of emissions. Again, not dramatic in any one moment, just persistent. And persistent is what living systems hate. They can handle acute stress sometimes, then recover. But chronic stress wears through adaptation. That is as true for radiation as it is for insomnia, grief, or poor nutrition. The body can compensate until it cannot. Speaking of compensation, there is another quiet effect of radiation exposure: the psychological and social strain of being doubted. When your symptoms are nonspecific, you can be dismissed. When the hazard is invisible, you can be accused of imagining it. When the employer is powerful, you can be pressured into silence. So part of the dial painter story is not chemistry, it is power dynamics. Who gets believed? Who gets protected? Who gets replaced? This is where science and society tangle, because data alone does not force change. Data has to be interpreted by people, and people have incentives. That is why the lawsuits mattered, not because lawsuits are pure, but because they change incentives. They put a cost on denial. In a strange way, the legal system became another measuring device, not measuring radiation, measuring accountability. And once accountability exists in one area, it tends to spread. Regulators begin to ask questions. Industry standards become more explicit. That is how you end up with agencies and guidelines, workplace exposure limits, material labeling rules, training requirements. It is all very boring and very protective. Boring is good here. Now your mind can drift outward again into your own ordinary life, because you are not a dial painter. You are a modern person in a modern room, surrounded by invisible things. You live at the bottom of an ocean of air. Air pressure presses on you constantly. A quiet weight. It does not crush you because your body pushes back. You live inside a cloud of microbes, most of which ignore you. Some help you digest food, some wait for a chance. Your immune system is always on patrol. Even when you sleep, you live under gravity, the most reliable bully. You do not notice it until you stand, lift, fall, or ache. Radiation is in that same category of invisible background reality. The difference is that radiation has a special talent. It can change atoms in your molecules directly. In small events, most background radiation does so rarely enough that repair keeps up. But when exposure increases, the balance shifts. So what does modern life do about this? It does what it always does. It builds layers. In homes, radon can be tested with small kits left in basements. If levels are high, ventilation can be improved, cracks sealed, sub-slab systems installed. It is not romantic, but it works. In airports, scanners and luggage systems are designed with shielding and standards. Workers have limits and equipment is tested. Again, time, distance, shielding translated into architecture. In hospitals, radiation use is tracked and justified. Imaging protocols aim for the lowest dose that still gives useful information. Technicians train for positioning, shielding, and minimizing repeats. In nuclear industries, controls are even more intense. Multiple barriers, redundant systems, emergency plans. Not because humans are wise, because humans are fragile, and the knowledge that humans are fragile is the most useful scientific insight of all. Now, there is something else worth saying quietly. Radiation fear is common and not always proportional. People panic about tiny doses and ignore bigger risks. For example, a short airplane flight increases cosmic radiation exposure a bit. It is real, but small. Meanwhile, smoking can deliver radioactive polonium into the lungs, along with everything else smoking does. You are not required to remember polonium. Just remember the pattern. Risk is contextual, and humans are bad at intuiting it. The dial painter tragedy is one of the reasons we have better intuition now. It taught the world that internal exposure can be far worse than external. It taught that repeated small doses can accumulate. It also taught that glowing things are not automatically magical. Sometimes they are just leaking energy patiently into whatever is nearby. And speaking of glowing, there is a deep irony tucked into the story. The visible glow was never the main danger. The glow was the phosphor lighting up a friendly green performance. The harm was from invisible particles and photons doing microscopic violence. The most dangerous part did not sparkle. That is another general life lesson, unfortunately. The threat is often the part you do not notice. Now, there is one more thread from the dial painters that deserves attention because it shaped later science. It is the idea of using human cases to infer biology in a careful way. The measurements of radium in bones became a tragic data set. Researchers could link internal radium burden to observed health outcomes. They could estimate thresholds, risks, and dose-response relationships. Dose-response is the concept that more exposure generally means more effect. Not always perfectly linear, but often trending. This became foundational in radiation protection. It also influenced how we think about other toxic exposures. Not just, is it dangerous, but at what dose, in what route, over what time. This is where the phrase, "the dose makes the poison," becomes relevant. It is often attributed to Paracelsus, an earlier physician and alchemist. Even water can be lethal at high enough intake. Radiation follows the same logic with extra complexity. Different radiation types, different tissue sensitivities, different repair capabilities. Some tissues divide rapidly and are more sensitive. Bone marrow, gut lining, hair follicles. Other tissues divide slowly and show effects later. That is why acute high doses can cause nausea, hair loss, immune collapse, while lower chronic doses raise long-term cancer risk. The dial painters mostly lived in the chronic world, a long exposure, internalized, with delayed consequences. Now, let the camera in your mind drift to a different quiet room. A laboratory, not a factory. A scientist uses a small vial with a radioactive label. The vial is stored in a lead-lined container, thick and dull. The label is clear. The inventory is logged. There is a fume hood, a controlled airflow that pulls vapors away. The scientist wears gloves, not because gloves are magical, because gloves are disposable barriers that keep contamination off skin. They use a pipette, not their mouth. Yes, mouth pipetting used to be a thing. Humans have always been impressively reckless with their own bodies. Mouth pipetting is exactly what it sounds like. Drawing liquid into a pipette by mouth suction. It was common in early labs until enough people were poisoned, infected, or contaminated. The dial painter story and the lab safety story rhyme. A shortcut that feels efficient until it becomes a case study. So modern lab culture bans mouth pipetting. It is written in rules, repeated in training, enforced with social pressure. A small barrier against the old human habit of using the mouth as a tool. That habit is ancient. We are primates. We explore with hands and teeth. Safety culture is, in part, the project of telling primates not to do primate things around hazards. Now, since we are still meandering through science, there is another use of radiation that is quietly related: sterilization. Radiation can kill microbes by damaging their genetic material, so medical equipment can be sterilized with gamma irradiation. Food can be irradiated to reduce pathogens and extend shelf life. This tends to alarm people because the word radiation is emotionally loud. But irradiated food does not become radioactive in the way people imagine. The radiation passes through, deposits energy, damages microbes, then it is gone. Like sunlight tanning skin, except more controlled and with different energies. The food itself does not turn into a glowing villain. Again, context, dose, type, and mechanism. The dial painters suffered because radioactive material was inside their bodies, emitting continuously. Sterilization uses external radiation exposure for a defined time, with no radioactive residue. Different scenario, different risk. Now, let the story keep drifting, because we are not done learning from this. There is a modern concept in safety that the dial painters helped crystallize: the hierarchy of controls. It is a way of ranking safety measures by reliability. At the top is elimination. Remove the hazard entirely. If you can replace radium paint with something else, do that. Next is substitution. Replace it with a less dangerous hazard. Then engineering controls, like ventilation and shielding. Then administrative controls, like time limits and training. Finally, personal protective equipment, gloves, and aprons. The reason for this hierarchy is simple. Personal protective equipment depends on perfect human behavior. Engineering controls can work even when you are tired. The dial painter era leaned too hard on worker behavior and too little on engineering. It assumed workers could be trained into safety while still using dangerous materials casually. Modern systems learn to build safety into the environment, not because humans became wiser, because the evidence made it unavoidable. And now, because you are listening in the dark, you can hold another small irony. The most important safety improvements are often the least visible. You do not notice the ventilation system when it works. You do not notice the labeling system when it prevents mistakes. You do not notice the training that stops someone from doing lip, dip, paint. Absence of disaster is quiet. That is why people undervalue it. Now, one more pivot, still connected to our glowing thread. Let us talk about the concept of half-life again, but in a more tactile way. Imagine you have a large crowd leaving a stadium. No one is told when to leave. Each person randomly decides to get up and go. At first, many leave quickly because there are many people. Later, fewer leave per minute because fewer remain. Radioactive decay is like that, except the atoms are the crowd. Each unstable atom has a probability of decaying per unit time. Half-life is the time it takes, on average, for half the crowd to leave. It does not mean the remaining atoms are safer. It means the activity declines over time, but slowly. If the half-life is long, radium has a long half-life, so it stays active for a long time. That is why it was attractive for glow paint. It did not fade in months like some other sources, but that same persistence is why internal contamination was so damaging. It kept delivering dose day after day, year after year. So when you hear half-life, do not think of it as a countdown timer. Think of it as a measure of patience, how long the atoms will keep making trouble. Now, because this is a deep dive journey, you can let the story brush past another group of people who learned radiation safety the hard way. Early radiologists. In the earliest days of X-rays, operators would test the beam on their own hands. They would watch bones appear on plates and feel amazed. Some developed burns, ulcers, and cancers. They lost fingers, hands, arms. They became living warnings in white coats. This happened because dose was poorly understood. Shielding was minimal. Exposure times were long. Over time, radiology became safer through better equipment, better detectors, shorter exposures, and strict shielding practices. Again, tragedy to protocol. The dial painters are part of this broader historical pattern. Humans discover something powerful, then injure themselves until measurement catches up. And that is, in a grim way, how you can describe much of technological progress. A series of enthusiastic mistakes, followed by cautious improvements. Now, let the story return to the worker again, because second person is where we live tonight. You are in the middle of it, not reading about it. You are at home after a shift, in a small room with ordinary furniture. You wash your hands, but you do not know what you are washing off. The glow on your fingertips might still be faint, not enough to light the room, just enough to notice in the dark like a guilty secret. You touch your face without thinking. You adjust your hair. You rub your eye. This is what contamination does. It uses normal behavior as a conveyor belt. If your clothing carries dust, it settles where you sit. It dusts the chair, the floor, the bedspread. It becomes part of the home's quiet grime. Later, safety protocols would treat work clothing as controlled, washed separately, sometimes disposed. But you are not in later. You are in early. So the hazard is not only in the factory, it is in the commute, the kitchen, the laundry basin, invisible, portable, patient, and if someone in your household is small, a child, their bones are growing rapidly. Growth involves lots of cell division and mineral deposition. That can make internalized radium even more risky. This is one of the reasons the story became so publicly disturbing. It was not just adult workers harmed at work. It was the suggestion that a fashionable industrial miracle could follow you home. The public does not like hazards that cross boundaries. A factory hazard is one thing. A home hazard feels like betrayal. So public pressure increased, and regulation became more thinkable. Because once fear reaches the living room, it becomes political. Now, in the realm of science, there is another quiet shift that followed. Scientists became more cautious about radium in consumer products. Early on, radium was put into all sorts of nonsense. Water crocks that claimed to infuse radium, cosmetics marketed as energizing, health tonics, some genuinely dangerous. As evidence accumulated, those products became harder to defend. Some were banned, others fell out of fashion. Some simply became embarrassing. This is how consumer protection evolves too, not through universal wisdom, but through accumulating lawsuits and data. And yes, it is exhausting that this is how it works, but the universe is not designed for comfort. It is designed for cause and effect. Now, speaking of cause and effect, there is a concept called latency. Latency is the time between exposure and outcome. Radiation-related cancers can have long latency periods, years, sometimes decades. This makes them hard to connect to a specific source. If you develop a cancer 15 years after exposure, you might have forgotten the exposure. And if the exposure was part of a job, the employer might pretend to forget too. Convenient amnesia is an industrial solvent. That is why long-term health tracking matters. That is why worker registries and occupational history are important. They help connect slow outcomes to earlier exposures. The dial painter investigations were early examples of this. Tracking who worked where, for how long, doing what tasks, building the timeline. Now, let the story pivot again to something calmer, but still related. The way the body handles calcium, and why radium could masquerade. Calcium is an essential ion. It helps with muscle contraction, nerve signaling, and bone structure. Your bloodstream keeps calcium levels tightly regulated. If calcium is low, hormones signal bone to release calcium. If calcium is high, the body stores more in bone or excretes it. Radium, being chemically similar, can ride some of these pathways. It can be taken up by bone-forming cells. It can be deposited where calcium would normally go. This mimicry is not unique to radium. Other toxic elements exploit similar tricks. Lead can substitute for calcium in bone as well. Strontium behaves similarly, and some strontium isotopes are radioactive. Biology is selective, but not perfectly. Your body evolved in an environment with certain elements. It did not evolve anticipating industrial radium paint. So when something new arrives with familiar chemistry, the body can be fooled, not because it is stupid, because it is optimized for the usual world, not the modern one. That is an important theme in many health hazards. Modern exposures often exploit ancient pathways. Now, there is also a misconception worth correcting gently. Some people imagine radiation as a poison that spreads through the body evenly. But internal contamination can be localized. If radium is deposited more in certain bones, those bones get more dose. That is why the jaw could be so affected. Local deposition plus local stress plus local bacteria. So the disease pattern can be patchy, uneven. One area fails first, then others. This patchiness can mislead doctors at first. A localized jaw problem looks like dental disease, not systemic radiation, until you see it repeated across multiple workers. Patterns are what wake science up, again and again. Not one strange case, many similar strange cases. Now, to keep the narrative moving forward, you can watch how these lessons got baked into standards that still exist. Today, radioactive materials are classified, labeled, and tracked. There are controlled areas in facilities where radioactive work happens. There are contamination monitors at exits. There are waste disposal regulations, because waste is the long tail of every hazard. There are training requirements. There are emergency procedures. There are audits that make sure procedures are followed. It is boring and expensive and effective. And when you think about it, that boredom is a kind of memorial. Each rule exists because someone discovered what happens without it. Now, as the story continues, there is an even stranger twist. The same radiation that was feared and regulated became a way to date the past. Radiometric dating, like carbon dating, uses predictable decay rates. Carbon-14 decays with a known half-life. By measuring how much remains in organic material, scientists estimate age. This is another example of turning decay into information. Decay is not just damage. It is a clock. In geology, uranium-lead dating measures decay chains in minerals. The Earth's age was estimated using these methods. Time itself became measurable through radioactivity. The dial painters were painting time onto watches. Radioactivity was also painting time onto rocks and bones, invisibly. It is almost poetic and deeply indifferent. The universe leaves timestamps everywhere if you know how to read them. Now, keep that thought on a low simmer because it connects to something else. If decay is a clock, then radioactivity is not rare. It is built into matter in specific isotopes. Your world contains carbon-14 naturally, created by cosmic rays interacting with the atmosphere. Living things incorporated while alive. When you die, the carbon-14 decays and is no longer replenished. Again, calm, efficient physics. A clock that starts ticking the moment life stops. And this brings you back, not to tragedy, but to the broader theme. Invisible forces do not care about your stories, but you can learn their rules and build a safer life around them. The dial painter story is one chapter in that learning. A painful one, but influential. Now, the next stretch of this journey will keep exploring how radiation became useful carefully, and how the same measurement culture spread into medicine and science. Because once you start treating invisible energy with respect, you begin to build an entire world of tools around it. And some of those tools are as gentle as they are unsettling. So you follow those tools into places that feel almost too clean to be related to that dusty workshop. You are in a modern imaging suite where the air is cool and filtered and the floors look freshly scrubbed on purpose. A machine arches over a table like a quiet animal, patient, expensive, and unable to feel guilt. A technician speaks in gentle routines because routines are what keep invisible risks boring. And the first useful thing you learn is that medical radiation is rarely a single blast of doom. It is usually a carefully limited conversation between energy and tissue. A short question asked in photons, answered in shadows. In a simple X-ray, you are using a brief burst of high-energy light. It passes through soft tissue more easily than bone. So bone casts a darker shadow on the detector, like a thick curtain. Early X-rays needed long exposure times, which meant more dose. Modern detectors are more sensitive, so they need less. The image quality improved, and the body pays a smaller fee. Then you step sideways into computed tomography, a CT scan. Here, the machine takes many X-ray images from different angles. A computer reconstructs slices, like cutting a loaf of bread without crumbs. It is incredibly useful, and also a reminder that usefulness often costs something. So clinics justify it, limit it, and adjust protocols for body size. The goal is never more radiation for fun. It is enough information to matter. And there is another quiet improvement, one that would have sounded like science fiction to the dial painters. Collimation, shaping the beam so it hits only what you need. Because if you do not have to irradiate a body part, you simply do not. This is the mature version of the lesson that took so long to learn. Do not let the hazard wander. Do not let energy spill where it has no job. Now you drift into nuclear medicine again, because it is the closest cousin to the glow paint story. You receive a tracer, a tiny amount of radioactive material chosen with intent. Not radium, not a long-lived tenant, but a brief visitor with an exit plan. A common tracer is technetium, used for imaging bones and organs. Another is fluorine attached to a glucose-like molecule in a PET scan. Tissues that use lots of glucose, like some tumors, can light up on the scan. And when you hear the word light up, do not picture a neon sign. Picture statistics. A detector ring counts individual events, then builds an image slowly, like fog forming on glass. It is eerie in a calm way. Your body becomes a landscape of probabilities, a map built from tiny decays that do not care what you are afraid of. The engineering around this is careful and, frankly, a little obsessive. Short half-lives, precise dosing, shielded syringes, controlled disposal. If you think this sounds like a culture that has been hurt before, good. It has. There is also a small detail that feels almost comforting. After many tracer studies, you are told to hydrate and urinate more. Not because it is mystical cleansing, but because the body eliminates tracer material that way. So even in modern nuclear medicine, the ending is a bathroom and a flush. Congratulations, the cosmic horror concludes with plumbing. Radiation therapy takes a darker turn, but still with that same measured restraint. You aim energy at a tumor not because you love violence, but because biology left you options. External beam therapy shapes radiation fields with moving metal leaves. These leaves form a custom window matching the tumor outline. The beam rotates around you, delivering dose from many directions. Each path contributes a little. The tumor gets the combined punishment while normal tissue gets fragments. It is not kind, but it is strategic. Sometimes therapy uses implanted sources called brachytherapy. A source is placed close to the tumor, so distance does the shielding for you. The body becomes its own geometry problem. And the calm lesson underneath is the same one that should have been in the factory. Root matters. Duration matters. Containment matters. In a well-run modern clinic, the radioactive source is tracked like a fragile treasure. There are checklists, sign-offs, double checks, and quiet alarms, because the worst errors are not dramatic, they are administrative. Now, speaking of quiet administrative errors, you drift into research laboratories. Not glamorous ones, the realistic kind, fluorescent lights, cluttered benches, coffee cups far away from the hazard zone. Here, radioisotopes are used as tracers in biology and chemistry. Phosphorus-labeled molecules track DNA synthesis. Sulfur-labeled amino acids track protein production. A scientist might be following a pathway the way you follow footprints in snow. Where does this molecule go? How fast does it change? The isotope becomes a tag, a tiny beacon with a predictable voice. And instruments listen for that voice, turning decays into counts, counts into graphs, graphs into conclusions that will be corrected later by someone younger and more caffeinated. Lab safety here is not heroic, it is repetitive. Work behind acrylic shielding when beta emitters are involved. Use gloves, change them often, survey surfaces, label everything. Everything gets a log entry because memory is fragile. Waste is segregated because some isotopes decay quickly and some do not. Storage is planned around half-life, like scheduling a visitor who refuses to leave. Some labs even hold short-lived waste until it decays to background levels. Then it can be disposed of as ordinary waste, depending on regulations. Decay in storage, a phrase that sounds poetic until you realize it is a closet. And through all of this, the dial painter lesson keeps whispering. Do not let it become dust. Do not let it become lunch. Now you widen the lens one last time to show how radiation became not only a tool, but a calendar. You already met carbon dating, which uses carbon-14. Carbon-14 forms in the upper atmosphere when cosmic rays hit nitrogen. Living things inhale and eat carbon continuously, keeping carbon-14 levels steady. When the organism dies, intake stops. The carbon-14 slowly decays, like a battery draining on a shelf. By measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to stable carbon, you estimate the time since death. It is not perfect because the world is messy. Atmospheric carbon changes over time. Contamination can confuse samples, so scientists calibrate carbon dates using tree rings and other records. Even the decay clock needs a clock to check it. For older rocks, you use longer-lived clocks. Uranium decays through a chain into lead. In certain crystals, like zircon, uranium can enter the crystal structure, while lead is mostly excluded at formation. So any lead found later is likely the product of decay. The crystal becomes a sealed diary, recording time in atoms. Geology, as usual, is patient and unbothered. This is the strange, calm redemption arc of radioactivity. The same process that injured workers when mishandled also reveals deep time. It lets you measure the age of Earth, the timing of eruptions, the history of continents. The universe takes and gives with the same indifferent hand. The moral is not that it balances out. The moral is that it does not care either way. Now, you return gently, one last time, to that original workshop image. Not to sensationalize it, but to let it settle. You see the bench again? The rows of pale watch faces? The fine brush strokes. You see the green glow pooling in tiny numbers like trapped dusk. It looks peaceful, like a harmless decoration for the night. But you know what the glow really is. Invisible decays tapping phosphor grains again and again without rest. Energy leaving atoms because they cannot hold themselves together forever. And you also know what made it so cruel. Not the existence of radiation, but the casual invitation into the body. A small habit taught as efficiency, paid for as biology. So, if you want the soft closing lesson, here it is. Progress is often built from experiments that never asked permission. Safety rules are rarely written by poets. They are written by injuries. That does not mean knowledge is evil. It means knowledge is expensive, and the invoice often arrives late. Sometimes it arrives in courtrooms, sometimes in quiet cemeteries. And yet, there is a tender kind of practicality in what followed. The world learned to measure what it could not see. It learned to treat invisible hazards like real ones, with limits and logs. Dose became a concept ordinary people could understand, at least roughly. Time, distance, shielding, containment, simple words that became life-saving. A culture of measurement replaced a culture of trust us. Now, lying in bed, you are surrounded by invisibles too. Not glamorous ones, just the usual collection. Air presses on you from all sides, heavy but evenly distributed. Microbes live on your skin, waiting for breakfast you will not give them. Gravity holds you down like a dependable hand. And yes, faint radiation passes through you right now. A tiny drizzle from rock, sky, and your own elements. So small that your cells mostly shrug and repair. The difference between that and disaster is not magic. It is amount and route and time. The dial painters did not have that language at first. They had a rhyme and a glow and an industry that preferred the lights dim. Later the language arrived, and with it, procedures that made the glow less personal. So when you think about the soft green light on those watch faces, let it be what it really was. A warning sign that did not know it was warning. A nightlight powered by the slow unmaking of matter. And if that feels bleak, good. Bleak can be calming, because bleak means it is not about you. It is about physics doing what physics does. You are safe, warm, and unglowing. The numbers on your clock do not need radium anymore. You inherit boring safety because someone else lived the loud version. And as your mind drifts, you can let one last thought hover like a fading phosphor trace. If invisible forces can hurt you so quietly, they can also reveal the hidden structure